Some secrets are better left buried, especially when they involve the lives of countless individuals and the suffering they endure in the name of progress. The horrors of World War II are etched into history, and most of us are familiar with the violence, the chaos, and the unimaginable cost of the conflict. But there is one chapter, buried deep in the shadows of wartime secrecy, that remains largely hidden from the world, until now. A chapter that reveals a chilling experiment, one that aimed to push the limits of human endurance, but instead led to catastrophic consequences. This is the true story of Project Nightmare, a secret operation during World War II that no one was ever meant to remember. Many of the world's greatest military operations remain shrouded in secrecy, sealed under layers of classified documents and lost to time. But not all secrets stay buried forever. Some of them, like Project Nightmare, fester in the dark corners of history, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And what we've learned from this experiment has changed everything we thought we knew about the lengths nations will go to win a war. World War II was a time of unimaginable conflict, where every nation fought for dominance on a global scale. The stakes were high, and as the battlefronts expanded, so did the desire to gain an upper hand. Governments turned to secretive measures, to classified operations hidden from public view, all in the name of victory. It was a time of desperation, a time when the lines between right and wrong blurred, and morality was often a casualty of war. Among these shadowy operations, one was unlike any other. While both the Allies and Axis powers waged war on land, sea, and air, they also waged a far quieter, more insidious war in the confines of laboratories and research facilities. Research into uncharted territory, where the human mind and body were pushed to their absolute limits. Project Nightmare was one such operation, undertaken by the Allied forces. Its purpose? To enhance soldiers in ways never before attempted, pushing them beyond human limits. The military believed that victory could be secured not just through superior tactics or better weapons, but through radical and unethical methods, treatments, and technologies that would alter the very essence of what it meant to be human. The goal was clear: to create super soldiers who could withstand the unimaginable horrors of war and give their nation the edge it needed to win. Of course, as with any government project of this magnitude, secrecy was paramount. The project's leaders worked behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny, away from the eyes of the world. Military scientists, researchers, and high-ranking officers were the driving force behind the experiment, their intentions cloaked in the guise of patriotism. The methods they employed, however, crossed lines that would forever change the lives of those involved. Among these figures, one name stands out: Dr. Leonard Shaw, a brilliant yet controversial scientist. Shaw was the mastermind behind Project Nightmare, a man obsessed with pushing the boundaries of science in the pursuit of victory. What started as a modest experiment soon spiraled into something much darker, as Shaw and his team grew more determined to see their vision realized. And with each new procedure, they blurred the line between experimentation and horror, unwilling to acknowledge the cost of their actions. The methods employed by the project's leaders were nothing short of disturbing. Scientists turned to experimental drugs, untested surgeries, and psychological conditioning, all in an attempt to alter the human mind and body. Soldiers were subjected to treatments that would have been considered cruel under any other circumstances. But in the context of war, such morality was easily set aside. The results were immediate and terrifying. Soldiers were pushed to their breaking points, enduring physical and mental suffering that left them shattered. As the soldiers were subjected to these radical experiments, their bodies began to change, but not in the ways that the scientists had hoped. Some soldiers became unrecognizable, their physical forms warped by the treatments. Others experienced intense psychological breakdowns, unable to distinguish reality from hallucinations. And as for the others, well, some simply disappeared, lost to the depths of the project's failures. But these were just the early signs of what would come next. The true extent of Project Nightmare, its incredibly dark results, and the toll it took on both the soldiers and those behind the operation are still largely hidden. What began as an attempt to gain an advantage in a brutal war soon turned into something far beyond the military's control. And as the experiment unfolded, the lines between science and madness became more and more difficult to distinguish. The first steps were taken, and the world would never be the same again. At the height of the war, victory seemed almost out of reach. For both the Allies and Axis powers, it was no longer just a matter of strategy or weaponry. The fight was against an enemy that had no bounds, an enemy that knew no limits. But what if soldiers could transcend those limits? What if they could endure the unimaginable, push beyond human capability, and withstand the kinds of physical and psychological strain that would break most men? This is where Project Nightmare began, an experiment born from the desire to create superhuman soldiers, to build warriors who could endure the unendurable and fight without fear or weakness. With a global war consuming the world, desperation set in, and the military turned to uncharted territories of science to gain the upper hand. The question was simple: what could be achieved when the human mind and body were pushed beyond their natural limits? Cutting-edge technologies, controversial medical research, and radical new theories were at the heart of this experiment. Techniques that promised to unlock new levels of human endurance were tested, no matter how dangerous. And in the darkest corners of war-torn nations, these untested methods gained traction. The goal was clear: soldiers capable of surviving the impossible, enduring unimaginable pain, and remaining emotionally unaffected, immune to fear, fatigue, and the chaos of battle. But for every breakthrough, there were risks, unknown, uncontrollable, and ultimately disastrous. Finding subjects for such an unprecedented experiment was no simple task. The military knew that they couldn't use ordinary soldiers. These individuals had to be more than just soldiers. They needed to be blank slates. And so, men were selected, young, eager, sometimes desperate. They were told they would serve their country in ways they never imagined, promised glory and honor for their sacrifice. But for most, the full reality of what they were volunteering for would never be clear until it was too late. Some of these men were willing to sign up, drawn by the promises of being part of something greater. Others coerced into it, their desperation for survival in the war twisting their choices. There were rumors of volunteers and those who were forced to join, some taken from the battlefield, and others promised a quick escape from captivity in war-torn regions. But once they were inside, it became clear: they were expendable. They were test subjects, treated as mere instruments in an experiment. Their lives were seen as secondary to the greater cause. Soldiers who joined, whether by choice or force, were nothing more than pawns in a game they didn't fully understand. Their faces were replaced by numbers, their identities erased. The soldiers were told they would receive specialized training, though no one ever explained the true cost of that training. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to step into a nightmare from which there would be no waking up. Once the men were selected, the experiment began in isolated locations, far from the eyes of the world. These secretive military facilities, tucked away in hidden corners of the globe, became laboratories for human endurance, testing ground for theories that were never meant to see the light of day. In these cold, sterile rooms, the soldiers were subjected to treatments that would alter their very bodies and minds. The methods ranged from psychological conditioning to dangerous drug injections designed to enhance physical strength and stamina. The soldiers, once young and eager, were forced to endure unimaginable trials. Drugs were injected into their veins, substances that promised to enhance their strength and endurance, but at an unknown cost. Surgical procedures altered their bodies, enhancing their strength but leaving them scarred, both physically and emotionally. The psychological conditioning went even further. Soldiers were exposed to extreme isolation, sensory deprivation, and stress-inducing scenarios. They were pushed to the edge of madness and beyond. The idea was simple: break them, then rebuild them into something else, something better. But the cost of this transformation was becoming apparent almost immediately. At first, the effects seemed promising. Soldiers exhibited increased strength, endurance, and resilience. They were able to endure longer than expected, push through pain that would have incapacitated most men, and withstand conditions that would have crushed others. But then came the cracks, the first signs of what they had unleashed. Some soldiers started to lose touch with reality. Others became unrecognizable, not just in their appearance, but in their very nature. The men, who had once stood proud and eager to serve, were now broken, unhinged, and increasingly hostile. The experiment, it seemed, was working, but at what cost? As the days passed, the toll on their minds became evident. Soldiers began experiencing extreme psychological breaks, hallucinations, violent outbursts, and emotional detachment. Some lost their sense of identity altogether, unable to recognize themselves in the mirror. Others grew aggressive, their temperaments altered beyond recognition. Yet the experiment continued. They were viewed as disposable, just another set of statistics, another set of numbers to be analyzed, studied, and ultimately discarded if they could no longer serve their purpose. As the experiment progressed, the early signs of success were overshadowed by something far more disturbing. What the scientists and military officers did not anticipate were the unforeseen side effects, not just physical, but psychological breakdowns that could not be explained. The soldiers, once tested for strength and endurance, began to exhibit behavior that was not only erratic, but terrifying. They became trapped in their own minds, unable to distinguish reality from the twisted hallucinations created by the very treatments meant to enhance them. Some soldiers started to report hallucinations, disturbing visions of enemies they couldn't escape from, of places they had never been, and faces they could no longer recognize. But the psychological toll went deeper. Extreme paranoia set in. The men who had once fought together as comrades were now turning against each other. They no longer trusted their own senses, and their reactions were violent, unprovoked. As the days passed, it became clear something was deeply wrong. Many of them began to speak of a total loss of humanity, a sense of becoming something else entirely, detached from their emotions, their impulses, even their sense of self. They could no longer connect with the world around them or with the people they had once known. Some soldiers described an empty void inside them, a feeling of being completely cut off from their own consciousness, as though the very essence of what it meant to be human had been stripped away. As the days wore on, the problem grew worse. What had been a carefully controlled experiment quickly began to spiral out of control. The military, initially confident in their methods, now faced a growing crisis. The soldiers, once selected for their strength, resilience, and mental fortitude, were breaking down in ways that defied all expectations. The project that had been hailed as a revolutionary success was now unraveling. It was no longer about creating super soldiers. It had become a battle to contain the monstrous consequences of the very procedures meant to save them. The soldiers, once bound by loyalty to their comrades, began to turn on one another. Stories of mutinies surfaced, with some soldiers becoming so unhinged that they attacked their fellow troops without warning. The line between allies and enemies blurred completely. These were no longer men. They had been altered, their minds shattered, their humanity lost. The experiment had broken them. The very men the military had hoped would become instruments of war were now uncontrollable, dangerous beings. As the violence escalated, the officers overseeing the experiment were faced with a chilling realization. They had created something far more dangerous than they could ever have imagined. But it was too late. There was no turning back. The experiment had gone too far, and those who had once been soldiers were now lost to something far darker. Desperation set in as the military tried, in vain, to reverse the damage done. Medical officers were brought in, their task clear: find a way to stabilize the men, to restore them to some semblance of control. But the damage was irreversible. The drugs, the surgeries, the psychological conditioning, each method had left an indelible mark on the soldiers. Some were confined to secret facilities, their bodies and minds too far gone to be of any use. They were locked away, forgotten, their existence erased from official records, deemed too dangerous to even study. The soldiers who could no longer be contained were placed in high-security compounds, isolated from the world. Some were never heard from again. Official records were altered, their names removed. The world outside moved on, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within those walls. The military had hoped to create soldiers who could endure the ultimate stress of war. Instead, they had created something that could not be controlled, and worse yet, something that no one was ready to face. The attempt to reverse the effects of the experiment had failed. The soldiers were never the same again, neither in body nor in mind. Their transformation was irreversible, and those who survived were left to wander in a shadow of their former selves. The project had claimed more than just their humanity. It had claimed their souls. The full scope of the experiment's failure was becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as an ambitious project to reshape the human body and mind had collapsed into chaos. The soldiers, once hopeful volunteers or unsuspecting participants, were no longer the instruments of war they had been promised to be. They were broken, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The project that had once been heralded as a cutting-edge breakthrough was now a nightmare with no solution. The military leaders, tasked with overseeing the project, were left with only one option: bury the evidence. Silence the survivors. Destroy the truth. As the scope of the disaster became clear, steps were immediately taken to erase any traces of the operation. Reports, results, and medical findings were locked away, sealed under layers of red tape. Even the most basic documents were classified, their contents rendered inaccessible, hidden from the public eye. But it wasn't enough to lock away the papers. Those who could testify to what had happened had to be silenced. Military personnel and researchers involved in the project were threatened with everything from imprisonment to disappearance. Those who dared to speak of the experiment would face consequences far worse than anyone could imagine. The final days of the project were marked by desperate efforts to bury the results and the personnel involved. Those few who survived the experiment were moved into high-security facilities where they could be controlled, contained, and erased from memory. Some were placed in remote locations, their whereabouts unknown to the outside world. Others were left to suffer in silence, their fates sealed with no public record, no acknowledgement of their existence. The military hoped the remnants of the project would simply fade into history, a dark chapter no one would ever read. In these final stages, the soldiers were no longer the subjects of a military experiment. They were the casualties, discarded by those who had created them. Some of these men, now shadows of who they once were left in isolation, their minds broken, their bodies used and abused until nothing of value remained. And yet, they were not allowed the dignity of a peaceful end. Their suffering, like the experiment itself, would be buried and forgotten. As the experiment was declared over, the military moved swiftly to erase every trace of Project Nightmare from existence. Records were destroyed, evidence was burned, names were erased from official military documents. Those who had been involved were either transferred, reassigned, or simply disappeared. Whispers of the project still lingered in the underground circles of intelligence officers, but these whispers were always met with threats of retribution, making sure the truth stayed buried. If the public ever learned what had truly happened, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Years passed, and the files remained sealed. National security laws prevented anyone from accessing the classified materials. The few who were brave enough to dig into the history of the experiment found nothing but empty spaces, gaps in the records where once there had been names and details. The project's existence, once known to only a handful of men, had now become a ghost, a forgotten operation, written out of history and left to rot in the dark corners of the military's archives. Even as time moved on, the survivors, the men who had been subjected to Project Nightmare, remained trapped in the shadows, ignored by the world they once fought for. Their bodies and minds, ravaged beyond repair, were hidden away. The military's actions were deliberate. It was a systematic erasure, not just of the records, but of the men themselves. Those who had witnessed the horrors of the project were either silenced or buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape. The truth had been buried, and those who might have spoken out were too afraid to reveal what they knew. Years passed, and the world moved on, but some things never stay buried forever. The truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of resurfacing, especially when the pieces of the puzzle are scattered and waiting to be connected. The official records were sealed, and the silence surrounding Project Nightmare remained unbroken for decades. But just when it seemed the truth would be lost to time, a group of modern-day investigators and whistleblowers began to unearth what had been long forgotten. Slowly, carefully, the fragments of the project started to surface. Leaked documents, hidden testimonies, and secret accounts that had survived the extensive cover-up. It started with a few whispers, accounts from individuals who had lived through the nightmare but never found the courage to speak out. Their stories, once silenced by fear, began to trickle into the hands of those determined to uncover the truth. Former soldiers, now long removed from the horrors they had faced, came forward with shocking revelations. Testimonies emerged, stories of twisted experiments, agonizing treatments, and psychological destruction, each more chilling than the last. The soldiers who had been involved in Project Nightmare did not escape unscathed. Some, broken beyond repair, spent the remainder of their lives in silence, haunted by the psychological scars that never healed. The drugs, the surgeries, the isolation, all of it had taken its toll in ways that could never be reversed. Many survivors led lives filled with trauma, some of them living in a haze of confusion, others plagued by anger or paranoia. Their families, those who had loved them before the experiment, were left to cope with the aftermath, often unaware of the horrors that had twisted their loved ones into something unrecognizable. Some of the men, their lives cut short by the very treatments meant to make them stronger, died young. The effects of the experiment had drained their bodies, leaving them frail and broken, unable to recover from the damage. Their stories, their names, were often lost to time. But their suffering had left a legacy, a painful reminder of the price of pushing the human body and mind too far. And even now, years later, the effects of Project Nightmare ripple through the world of modern military research. Project Nightmare may have been buried, but its legacy lives on in the hidden corners of military research. Modern-day experiments, whether acknowledged or not, still carry the echoes of those dark days. The desire to create a new breed of soldier, to push the limits of human endurance, is not easily extinguished. And the technologies developed in the wake of Project Nightmare continue to shape the future of warfare, raising new questions about the ethical lines that continue to be crossed in the name of progress. As the truth begins to emerge, the lingering questions remain. Why was this experiment allowed to continue? What drove the military to push these men beyond their limits, to sacrifice so much for the sake of a theoretical advantage in war? What did they hope to achieve, and at what cost? The answers to these questions remain elusive, locked away in the same files that were sealed and forgotten for so long. History, it seems, has a way of hiding its darkest secrets. Some chapters are written to be forgotten, and others are erased completely. But the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. What remains of Project Nightmare is a painful reminder of the lengths to which nations will go in the name of war, of the cost of pushing human beings beyond their natural limits. And even as we uncover the remnants of this experiment, we are forced to confront the questions that still haunt us. Who were the true victims of Project Nightmare? The soldiers who were broken, or the men who created it? The truth of Project Nightmare still raises more questions than it answers. The soldiers may have been forgotten, but their story remains, echoing through the hidden corners of history. What began as an attempt to create the ultimate soldier turned into a tragic experiment in human endurance, and the legacy of that failure will continue to resonate long after the last document is destroyed and the last whisper of truth is silenced. As for the men who lived through it, their suffering may have ended, but the shadow of Project Nightmare will never truly fade.